When we imagine the Middle Ages, our minds often conjure images of muddy streets, unwashed peasants, and grimy clothes worn until they nearly rotted from the body. The stereotype of the filthy medieval world has become one of the most persistent myths in popular culture. Yet the truth, as always, is far more nuanced. Clean clothing was not only a matter of personal comfort, it was bound to social status, religious values, and even ideas of morality. To keep one's garments in good order was not simply about hygiene, it was about honor, reputation, and survival. A medieval villager's life was ruled by practicality. Clothes were precious, often hand-spun and hand-sewn, passed down or patched until they could no longer be used. Washing them was a serious task, one that demanded effort, time, and resources. For nobles and wealthy townsfolk, clothing was an outward expression of wealth and power, and keeping it pristine was essential. For peasants, clean clothes might mean nothing more than scrubbing mud from work tunics. Yet even the humblest farmer knew the importance of appearing respectable during church or on feast days. What we often forget is that medieval people valued cleanliness differently than we do today. For them, bathing the body and washing clothes were separate concepts. A person might not bathe often, but clean linen shirts and undergarments were changed with surprising frequency because linen could wick away sweat and be washed more easily than heavy wool. To wear fresh linen was, in fact, seen as a mark of hygiene, even if the wearer had not touched water in weeks. And washing was no small matter. In villages, rivers and streams became communal laundries, where women beat heavy garments against stones to force out dirt and grease. In towns, professional laundresses offered their services to wealthier households, scrubbing and bleaching fabrics with homemade soaps, lye, or even more pungent substances such as stale urine. Harsh but effective. Monasteries, too, maintained careful washing routines, as monks considered cleanliness a form of discipline and devotion. To the medieval mind, clothing was deeply tied to morality and social order. A knight could not ride to court in a mud-streaked tunic, lest his honor be questioned. A merchant's wife would not attend church in a soiled gown, for it would shame her family. Even peasants saved their best, cleanest clothes for holy days and weddings, treating their garments with care because they were symbols of their place in the world. Dirty or torn clothes did not simply suggest poverty. They could signal laziness, vice, or even sin. Of course, the degree of cleanliness depended greatly on wealth. The poor struggled to maintain their garments, relying on rivers and simple soaps. Nobles, by contrast, employed servants to wash delicate silks and woolens with special care, scenting them with herbs like lavender or rosemary. What might be unbearable labor for a peasant woman became a sign of luxury and refinement in the courts of kings and queens. So when we ask, how did medieval people wash and keep their clothes clean? The answer is more fascinating than the myth of dirtiness suggests. They had no washing machines, no detergents, no bright chemical bleaches. Yet through ingenuity, persistence, and social necessity, they found ways to keep their garments fresh and respectable. Clean clothing was not a rarity, it was a necessity, shaping how one was seen and judged in a world where appearances mattered as much as deeds. In short, medieval laundry was not merely about fabric and water, it was about identity, survival, and status. To understand it, we must step into the fields where women bent over rivers, into the bustling streets where laundresses plied their trade, and into the castles where silks were delicately perfumed. Only then can we see the full picture, that even in the so-called dark centuries, the people of the Middle Ages fought against dirt with determination and creativity. To understand medieval laundry, one must first understand the fabrics themselves. Unlike the endless variety of textiles we enjoy today, the Middle Ages offered only a limited range of materials, each with its own character, difficulties, and rituals of care. Clothes were not disposable. They were precious investments of time and labor. A single tunic might represent hours of spinning, weaving, dyeing, and sewing. To damage such a garment through careless washing was a costly mistake, and so every fabric demanded its own method of cleaning. The most common fabric across Europe was wool. Warm, durable, and relatively easy to produce, it clothed peasants and nobles alike. But wool carried a challenge. It shrank and stiffened when soaked in hot water, and its natural oils resisted soap. Peasants often washed woolen clothes sparingly, preferring instead to air them out, brush them, or simply beat out the dust. Wealthier households employed fullers, specialists who treated wool by scouring it with lye or even stale urine, substances whose ammonia stripped away grease. Though unpleasant, this process made wool cleaner and softer, and it was an accepted part of textile care. Linen, by contrast, was prized for its freshness. Woven from the fibers of the flax plant, linen was smooth, light, and breathable, making it perfect for undergarments and shirts worn next to the skin. Unlike wool, linen could be washed frequently in water without damage, and because it absorbed sweat, it was considered essential for cleanliness. Changing into clean linen was almost as important as bathing, for it created the impression of purity and hygiene. Monks and nobles alike prized white linen, often bleached in the sun to maintain its brightness. Its ease of washing made it the true cornerstone of medieval hygiene. Silk, the fabric of luxury, posed a different challenge. Imported at great cost from the East, it was fragile, delicate, and often richly dyed. Such garments could not be scrubbed in rivers or boiled in cauldrons. Instead, servants carefully sponged away stains, used vinegar or wine to clean spots, and perfumed the fabric with herbs. Silk garments were so valuable that they were sometimes passed down through generations, their colors refreshed by re-dyeing when they faded. For the nobility, silk was not only clothing, it was an heirloom and a symbol of wealth, guarded as carefully as gold. Even humbler fabrics carried risks. Hemp, coarse and rough, was used for work clothes, sacks, and ropes, and while it could withstand harsher treatment, it never lost its heavy feel. Blended fabrics, though less common, required trial and error to wash without ruining them. Each textile bore its own rules, learned through practice and passed down from mothers to daughters, from servants to apprentices. What made laundry more complex still was the matter of dyes. Many medieval clothes were colored with natural plant-based or mineral dyes, which could easily fade or run if washed improperly. A bright red tunic, dyed with madder root, might bleed into water and lose its brilliance if scrubbed too harshly. Blues from woad or indigo were more resilient, but still needed care. For peasants, faded clothes were accepted as inevitable, but for nobles, maintaining rich, vibrant colors was essential to their identity. Thus, washing was not only about removing dirt, it was about preserving status, symbolized in the very hues of one's garments. And always the difficulty lay in balance. To wash too little risked dirt, odor, and shame. To wash too much risked destroying the fabric itself. The peasant wife who scrubbed her husband's woolen tunic had to gauge just enough cleaning to keep it serviceable, while the noble's laundress needed skill to keep silks and linens beautiful without causing irreparable harm. Laundry, then, was not merely work, it was a craft, demanding knowledge, patience, and respect for the materials that clothed the body and defined one's place in the world. For peasants, laundry was not a chore completed once a week in the comfort of a home. It was an exhausting communal ritual, often tied to the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of survival. Clothes were too few and too valuable to be washed casually. A peasant family might own only a handful of tunics and shifts, patched and repatched over years. To risk damaging them through frequent scrubbing was unthinkable. Washing, therefore, was done with care, and often only when absolutely necessary. The work was grueling. Women, who bore the bulk of the responsibility, carried baskets of soiled garments to rivers, streams, or communal washhouses. There, they bent for hours over cold water, beating heavy woolens against flat stones or wooden boards to loosen dirt. Their hands, raw from icy water and coarse fabrics, were often chafed and cracked by the end of a day's washing. The riverbank became a place of labor, chatter, and gossip. Laundry was work, but it was also one of the few communal spaces where women could share news, advice, and laughter. Soap, as we know it, was a rare luxury for peasants. Instead, they relied on ash lye, a mixture of wood ash and water that produced a caustic solution capable of stripping grease. Sometimes they combined it with animal fats to make crude soap. In some cases, stale urine, collected in clay pots and left to ferment, provided a harsh but effective cleaning agent thanks to its natural ammonia. The smell was unpleasant, but in a world where necessity ruled, effectiveness mattered more than fragrance. Clothes were often left to soak in large wooden tubs filled with these cleaning solutions. Women stirred the garments with wooden paddles, then rinsed them in rivers or wells. Heavier pieces, like cloaks and woolen tunics, might be spread on grassy fields or hedges to dry in the sun, where the light also acted as a natural bleach. White linen shirts, prized for their cleanliness, were laid out to brighten under the open sky, the sun doing what soap could not. Because laundry was so demanding, peasants often wore their clothes until they could no longer be tolerated. Underclothes, particularly linen shifts, were washed more frequently since they absorbed sweat and could be cleaned without damage. Outer garments of wool were washed less often, as the process was too harsh for repeated use. Instead, peasants shook out dirt, brushed dust away, or let garments air in the breeze. This rhythm of care balanced necessity against practicality. Children often went half-dressed, wearing tunics without undergarments, which reduced the number of clothes that needed laundering. Peasant men wore the same work tunics for days or weeks, only donning their cleanest set for Sunday Mass or festivals. Women carefully guarded their best clothing, washing it sparingly and saving it for church, weddings, and other rare moments of dignity and display. The work of washing was not only about hygiene, it was a matter of respectability. Even peasants understood the importance of presenting themselves cleanly for religious occasions, for weddings, and for community events. A woman with bright linen, even if her outer garments were patched and worn, showed diligence and pride. A man with a washed tunic on holy days demonstrated respect for God and community alike. Peasant laundry, then, was more than a domestic task. It was survival. It was an expression of identity, performed with sweat, labor, and resourcefulness. Though their methods may seem crude to us, peasants preserved their dignity through water, ash, and the strength of their hands. In every scrubbed shift and sun-bleached cloak, there was a testament to resilience, proof that even in poverty, people strove to keep their world and themselves clean. If laundry for peasants was about survival, laundry for the nobility was about status. For nobles, clothing was not simply a necessity. It was a declaration of wealth, refinement, and power. A soiled tunic or faded gown could tarnish a reputation as surely as a broken oath. Maintaining the brilliance of silks, velvets, and richly dyed woolens was a task entrusted to servants and specialists whose skill ensured that noble garments retained both their beauty and their symbolic weight. In noble households, laundry rarely took place by the riverbank. Instead, it was handled within the estate by laundresses, chambermaids, or even professional fullers hired for specific tasks. These workers were tasked with separating garments by fabric and color, because a misstep could ruin clothing worth more than a peasant's yearly income. Silks and fine linens were gently sponged with vinegar, wine, or rose water, while woolens might be treated with lye and carefully rinsed. The work was less brutal than peasant washing, but it demanded far greater delicacy. Fragrance played a central role. Nobles did not simply want clean clothes, they wanted garments that exuded luxury. Clothes were often scented with herbs like lavender, rosemary, and thyme, or perfumed with imported oils. Storage chests were lined with sachets of dried flowers and spices, both to keep away moths and to leave a pleasant aroma on garments. A gown that smelled faintly of rosemary or rosewater was as much a statement as the embroidery stitched upon it. This was refinement elevated above the grime of the lower classes. Silk, in particular, was treated with reverence. It was rarely washed in the conventional sense, as water could damage the delicate threads. Instead, stains were dabbed away, and garments were refreshed with perfume. Some silks were re-dyed when their colors faded, a costly process that ensured gowns remained vibrant for years. When silks wore thin, they were sometimes cut down and reshaped into new garments, each iteration cared for with scrupulous attention. The handling of silk was both art and science, preserving not only fabric but prestige. Noble linens, by contrast, were washed frequently, much like those of the peasants, but with far greater care. Bright white linen undershirts, chemises, and bedsheets were soaked, scrubbed, and laid out in the sun to bleach, then ironed smooth with heated stones or metal implements. To wear gleaming white linen was a sign of cleanliness and wealth, for only the privileged could afford the labor and materials required to maintain such brightness. A nobleman with immaculate linen could stand in court, confident that his appearance reflected his station. Dyes posed another challenge. Rich hues, deep reds from madder, brilliant blues from woad, vibrant purples from rare sources, were expensive and status-laden. Servants were trained to wash these garments without stripping the color. Some clothes were cleaned with mixtures designed to preserve the dye, while others were carefully brushed or shaken rather than submerged. A faded gown reflected poorly on the household, while a brightly dyed robe declared enduring wealth. For nobles, laundry was not performed in isolation, but as part of a broader cycle of presentation and pageantry. Clothes were displayed at banquets, tournaments, and church ceremonies, where every detail was noticed. The difference between a perfumed silk gown and a dull wool tunic was not merely aesthetic, it was political. It announced who held power, who belonged to the elite, and who did not. Thus, the noble approach to laundry reveals much about the medieval world. Where peasants labored against dirt with ash and river water, nobles pursued elegance with rose water and delicate hands. Both sought cleanliness, but for different ends, one for survival, the other for reputation. And in every perfumed gown and gleaming linen, noble laundry proclaimed what mattered most in their world. Not merely to live, but to appear radiant in the eyes of God, court, and kin. To modern eyes, medieval laundry methods may seem crude, but in truth, they were resourceful, ingenious, and surprisingly effective. Without modern detergents or bleaches, people relied on the natural materials around them, some harsh, some fragrant, and many that might shock us today. The medieval washtub was as much a workshop of chemistry as it was a basin of water, combining earth, fire, and even waste into tools of cleanliness. One of the most common cleaning agents was wood ash. When mixed with water, ash produced lye, a caustic alkaline solution that could cut through grease and stains. Peasants often poured hot water through ash to create this primitive soap, then soaked or scrubbed their clothes in the mixture. It was harsh on fabric and skin alike, but it worked. Fullers, specialists in cleaning wool, relied heavily on lye to scour away the natural oils in cloth, leaving garments softer and lighter. Soap, too, existed in the Middle Ages, though it was rougher than the smooth bars we know today. Made from animal fat and lye, it produced a greasy, gritty substance that was stored in lumps or blocks. Peasants made crude versions at home, while nobles purchased finer varieties scented with herbs or imported from regions with established soap-making traditions, such as Castile in Spain or Marseille in France. To own perfumed soap was itself a sign of status, a small luxury that announced refinement. Another, more startling tool was urine. Collected in large clay jars and left to ferment, stale urine became rich in ammonia, which was an excellent natural cleanser. Though its smell was repellent, its effectiveness made it a staple of medieval laundry. Fullers used it to clean wool on an industrial scale, stamping and treading upon cloth in great vats of the liquid. In cities, households sometimes sold their urine to fullers, ensuring nothing went to waste. To modern sensibilities, it is shocking, but for the Middle Ages, it was simply practical chemistry. Vinegar was also widely used, particularly for stains and odor. Its acidic bite helped to freshen garments, and it was especially useful for fine fabrics that could not withstand harsher treatments. A noble's laundress might sponge silk with a diluted solution of vinegar and water, sometimes adding rose petals or herbs to soften the scent. Herbs themselves were essential in both peasant and noble laundry. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, and mint were tucked into storage chests to deter insects and leave a pleasant fragrance. Peasants used what grew around them, wild thyme or chamomile, to scent garments, while nobles imported exotic spices or oils. The presence of fragrance elevated laundry beyond mere cleanliness. It turned clothing into an experience of luxury. Water, of course, was the foundation of all laundry. Rivers and streams served as wash sites, their constant flow carrying away dirt. In cities, wells and cisterns provided water, though the labor of hauling it was immense. For the poor, water meant endless back-breaking trips with buckets. For the wealthy, servants did the hauling, filling tubs where garments were soaked, scrubbed, and rinsed. Tools were simple but effective. Wooden paddles for stirring garments in tubs, washboards of rough planks or stone for scrubbing, heavy stones for beating dirt out of fabric. Women often relied on their own strength, wringing and twisting heavy cloth by hand before spreading it in fields or hanging it over hedges to dry. In noble households, irons heated with coals or stones smoothed out fine linens, leaving them crisp and gleaming. Each of these tools and ingredients tells a story of necessity and ingenuity. In an age before chemistry was science, medieval people understood how to harness the properties of their world. Ash cleansed with its alkaline strength, vinegar cut through grime, herbs sweetened the air, and even waste became useful. Laundry was not simply scrubbing, it was the art of transforming dirt into dignity, with whatever means the earth and household could provide. Washing clothes in the Middle Ages was not only about removing dirt, it was also about reviving color, repairing damage, and ensuring that garments continued to serve their symbolic role. Clothes were not disposable items. They were investments, sometimes passed down through generations. When colors faded, Medieval people did not simply accept dullness. They sought to renew garments through dyeing, bleaching, and other restorative practices. In this way, laundry and fabric care blurred into the art of preservation and transformation. Color was deeply significant in medieval society. A vivid red cloak spoke of wealth and authority, while a bright blue tunic could signify prestige and taste. The dyes used to achieve these hues came from natural sources, but they were often fragile. Reds made from madder root or cochineal faded with repeated washing. Yellows from weld or saffron dulled quickly in sunlight. Only the most expensive dyes, such as Tyrian purple or indigo, had the resilience to endure. Thus, refreshing garments through re-dyeing was a common practice, especially among the wealthy. Peasant households, of course, relied on simpler methods. When a garment faded, they might re-dye it with whatever plants grew locally: nettles for greenish hues, onion skins for yellow, walnut husks for brown. These colors were earthy and subdued, matching the rhythm of peasant life. A patched tunic might bear layers of color, its fabric renewed over and over again until it could no longer hold a stitch. For peasants, dyeing was as much about prolonging life as it was about beauty. For the nobility, dyeing was a matter of prestige. A noblewoman's gown might be sent to skilled dyers in towns or cities who carefully soaked the fabric in vats of imported dye. Indigo from the East, or Kermes red from the Mediterranean, produced dazzling results that few could afford. Nobles also commissioned garments to be over-dyed, layering colors to create rich, deep tones such as purples or blacks. Black dye, in particular, was notoriously difficult to achieve, and therefore a sign of sophistication and wealth. Maintaining these colors was an ongoing task of noble laundry, one requiring expert skill and constant attention. Bleaching, too, played an important role. Linen garments, prized for their brightness, were frequently spread on fields in the sun after being washed, a process known as grass bleaching. Over time, repeated exposure to sunlight whitened the fabric, creating the crisp, clean look associated with purity. In monasteries, where white linen habits symbolized devotion, bleaching became almost a ritual in itself, a physical expression of spiritual cleanliness. Garments were also refreshed through mending and embellishment. Torn seams were repaired, faded hems covered with new trim, and worn sleeves replaced with fabric salvaged from other clothes. In noble courts, this practice could even turn into fashion. A gown might be refitted, lined with fresh fur, or decorated with new embroidery, effectively transforming an old dress into something new. In this sense, refreshing clothes was not only about cleaning, but about reinventing them. Scents, too, became part of this renewal. Herbs and flowers were used to mask the harsh odors of lye, vinegar, or urine from the washing process. Lavender, rose petals, and rosemary were sewn into sachets and placed in storage chests. In some cases, garments were even lightly smoked over aromatic woods to give them a lasting fragrance. A noble entering a hall smelling faintly of rosemary carried not just the scent of herbs, but the air of refinement and wealth. Through these methods, medieval people extended the life of their clothing far beyond what modern consumers would imagine. A gown might last decades, changing in appearance many times through re-dyeing, mending, and scenting. Each act of care reflected the value of the garment, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of identity and status. To refresh clothing was to refresh one's place in the world. Thus, medieval laundry was never only about washing, it was about transformation. Clothes were renewed, reborn, and given fresh life through ingenuity. Every faded tunic recolored, every linen bleached in the sun, every gown perfumed with rosemary carried the same unspoken truth. In a world where fabric was precious, No garment was ever truly finished until it was worn to threads. Washing was only one battle in the medieval war against dirt. The greater struggle lay in the daily task of keeping garments clean for as long as possible. In an age when laundry required aching muscles, riverbanks, and harsh chemicals, prevention was far better than cure. Medieval people, both peasant and noble, developed strategies to guard their clothes from filth, insects, and decay, extending the time between washes and ensuring that valuable garments lasted for years. One of the simplest techniques was layering. Linen undergarments, particularly shirts and shifts, were worn beneath heavier outer clothes. These linen pieces absorbed sweat and body oils, keeping wool or silk tunics from becoming soiled. Because linen could be washed more frequently without damage, it acted as a protective barrier. Changing into clean linen gave the appearance of cleanliness, even if the outer garment had not been washed for months. In many ways, undergarments were the medieval secret weapon against dirt. Drying and airing were also crucial. After a day's work, peasants often hung their woolen tunics near a fire or in the open air to let moisture and odors dissipate. Airing out garments reduced the buildup of grime and helped them last longer before requiring the dreaded scrub in ash and water. In noble households, clothing might be laid out in sunny courtyards or aired with fragrant herbs, combining freshness with fragrance. Storage was another battlefield. Clothes were precious and had to be protected not only from dirt, but also from pests like moths and mice. Peasants stored garments in wooden chests or hung them in rafters, where smoke from the hearth deterred insects. Nobles took greater precautions. Their storage chests were lined with cedar, herbs, or perfumed sachets. Lavender and rosemary were particularly favored, both for their pleasant aroma and their insect-repelling properties. To open a noble's chest and find gowns scented with flowers was itself a mark of refinement. Fire and smoke, surprisingly, also played a role. The constant smoke from peasant hearths darkened clothes, but preserved them by discouraging pests and mildew. Smoke-curing clothing may not sound appealing, but it added a layer of protection in damp, insect-ridden environments. Nobles, in contrast, sometimes deliberately smoked garments with fragrant woods, leaving silks and velvets imbued with a subtle perfume. For peasants, keeping clothes clean meant guarding their Sunday best. Work garments were inevitably stained with mud and sweat, but the best tunic or gown was treated with near-sacred care. It might be worn only on holy days, weddings, or festivals, then carefully stored until the next occasion. To soil it carelessly would mean shame and hardship, as few families could afford to replace such garments quickly. Nobles, with greater resources, could afford a larger wardrobe, but even they sought to preserve the longevity of their expensive clothes. Servants brushed dust from velvet, sponged stains from silk, and carefully folded garments to prevent damage. Cloaks and gowns were often lined with fur, which added warmth but also required constant attention to avoid infestation. Every article of clothing represented an investment, and therefore every stain, moth hole, or faded patch was treated with urgency. Cleanliness, then, was as much about discipline as about soap. It meant changing undergarments, storing clothes properly, protecting them from insects, and treating fabrics with the respect they deserved. Even peasants, with their limited means, showed remarkable resourcefulness in keeping their clothing serviceable for as long as possible. Nobles, meanwhile, elevated cleanliness into an art of luxury, with herbs, perfumes, and careful stewardship transforming laundry into a ritual of refinement. Ultimately, the daily care of clothes reflected medieval values themselves: practicality, economy, and status. The poor did what they must to preserve their few garments. The rich turned the same task into a performance of wealth. But in both cases, keeping clothes clean was not a trivial matter. It was a way of protecting dignity in a world where appearance and reputation carried immense weight. Laundry in the Middle Ages was not always a solitary, domestic chore. It was often a communal event, one that revealed the social fabric of medieval life as clearly as it scrubbed the fabric of clothing. To wash garments was to gather, to labor together, to talk, and to reinforce the bonds of community. For women especially, laundry was as much about social roles and networks as it was about soap and water. In villages, women carried baskets of soiled garments to the riverbanks or streams. These sites became natural gathering points where hours of beating, scrubbing, and wringing were lightened by conversation. Gossip, local news, and advice flowed as freely as the water itself. Mothers taught daughters the skills of laundry here, passing down the knowledge of how to treat different fabrics, mix ash lye, or remove stains. It was work, but it was also culture, binding women together in a rhythm of labor and companionship. This communal nature was not unique to peasants. In towns and cities, public washhouses, sometimes operated by municipalities, provided places for laundresses to work, often for hire. These laundresses became a distinct social group, women who supported themselves by washing the clothes of wealthier households. Their reputation could vary. Some were respected for their hard work, while others were looked down upon for handling unclean garments, their labor considered both necessary and lowly. Yet their role was vital, keeping the city's people clothed and presentable. Professional laundresses often handled not only ordinary garments, but also fine linens for merchants, clerics, and minor nobles. Their skill with delicate fabrics was valued, but their lives were difficult, marked by long hours and little pay. Still, in an age when women's work was often restricted, laundry offered one of the few paths to economic independence, however modest. To hire a laundress, on the other hand, was a mark of rising status, proof that one's family could afford to outsource the most grueling household chores. In noble households, laundry was both labor and performance. Dozens of servants, often under the direction of a laundress-in-chief, worked to clean and maintain fine garments. Their efforts were invisible at court, yet essential, for no lord or lady could appear in stained or wrinkled attire without risking mockery. Behind the shimmering gowns and perfumed tunics displayed in feasts and tournaments lay the hidden toil of these workers, their labor ensuring that nobility could shine in the eyes of peers and rivals. There was also a moral and religious dimension to communal washing. Clean clothes were tied to ideas of purity, especially in preparation for church. Women gathering at the river before major feast days were not only washing fabric, they were readying themselves and their families for sacred events. The act of laundering clothes became, in some ways, an act of devotion, ensuring that one's outward appearance matched inward piety. Yet not all viewed laundresses and communal washing positively. Medieval literature often teased or satirized women at the riverbanks, portraying them as gossipers or idle chatterers. Others connected laundresses to immorality, hinting that women who earned wages outside the home might also engage in scandalous behavior. These stereotypes reveal not only the essential role of laundry, but also the social anxieties it carried, an occupation both respected for its necessity and demeaned for its associations with dirt. Thus, communal washing was never merely about cleanliness. It was about community, identity, and hierarchy. The riverbank, the washhouse, and the noble laundry hall all reflected the same truth, that clothing tied people together through work, through status, and through the need to be seen as clean. Laundry, in its communal form, revealed the beating heart of medieval society. where survival, gossip, faith, and reputation were scrubbed and wrung together under the same flow of water. In the medieval world, clothing was never just fabric stitched together to cover the body. It was a marker of identity, a statement of rank, and a visible measure of one's moral and social worth. Cleanliness, or the lack of it, spoke volumes. To wear soiled, tattered garments suggested poverty, disorder, and even sin, while clean, bright clothing implied diligence, virtue, and, in the case of the nobility, wealth and prestige. In this way, laundry and the care of garments became inseparable from the very structure of medieval society. For peasants, clothing was tied to survival, and the cleanliness of garments often depended on necessity rather than choice. Work in fields, barns, and workshops left clothes stained with mud, sweat, and ash. Yet on Sundays or feast days, the same men and women appeared in church wearing their cleanest shifts, freshly scrubbed tunics, and sun-bleached linens. This transformation carried meaning beyond hygiene. It showed respect for God and for the community. A clean tunic on a holy day was a declaration that, despite poverty, one still possessed dignity. The nobility, by contrast, lived in a world where appearances could determine influence. A nobleman's gown or a lady's gown was not merely fashion, but politics. To appear in finely washed, perfumed, and vividly colored garments was to demonstrate authority and refinement. A faded tunic or wrinkled silk could be as damaging as a whispered rumor, suggesting neglect or decline. Cleanliness, in this sense, was a weapon, another way of asserting superiority over both rivals and the lower classes. The church also weighed heavily on the matter of clothing. Priests preached that outward cleanliness reflected inward purity, and monasteries upheld strict routines for washing and bleaching their linens. To appear at Mass in dirty clothes could be seen as disrespectful, while clean garments suggested readiness to enter the sacred space. In some traditions, white linen itself became symbolic of moral purity, elevating the act of laundry into a spiritual duty. Interestingly, even laws reflected these social divisions. Sumptuary regulations dictated who could wear what fabrics and colors. Peasants were restricted to simple woolens, while silks, velvets, and rich dyes were reserved for the upper classes. But within these constraints, cleanliness still mattered. A peasant might not own velvet, but a well-kept, neatly washed tunic could still set him apart from a negligent neighbor. For the nobility, appearing in garments that gleamed with freshness and fragrance reinforced the invisible line between themselves and those who toiled below. Cleanliness also intersected with gender roles. Women, tasked with the endless cycle of washing, were judged by the state of their family's clothes. A wife whose husband wore clean linen and whose children appeared in well-kept garments was seen as diligent and respectable. A household that appeared dirty reflected poorly on its mistress, regardless of poverty or circumstance. In this sense, laundry became not only a domestic duty, but a measure of female virtue. Yet there was irony in these divisions. Nobles who prided themselves on perfumed silks and spotless linens owed much of their appearance to the labor of humble laundresses, often women of low status. The very people who kept the aristocracy resplendent were those most associated with dirt, gossip, or dishonor. Cleanliness, then, was not only about class, it was about who had the power to make others appear clean while remaining invisible themselves. In the end, medieval clothing revealed the paradox of the age. Everyone, from peasant to prince, understood the value of clean garments. For the poor, it was a hard-won dignity, wrested from rivers and ash. For the rich, it was an assertion of superiority, maintained by others' toil. To keep clothing clean, was to keep one's place in the order of the world intact. The humble shirt scrubbed on a river stone and the silk gown perfumed with rosewater both proclaimed the same truth. In the Middle Ages, how clean you appeared was as important as who you were. When we peel back the layers of medieval life, laundry emerges as something far greater than a household task. It was a window into the values, struggles, and ingenuity of an age. Clean clothes meant survival for peasants, respectability for merchants, and prestige for nobles. They symbolized purity in religion, diligence in women, and honor in men. To wash a tunic was not just to scrub dirt away, it was to defend one's dignity in a world that judged harshly by appearances. What stands out most is the creativity and resourcefulness of medieval people. With no detergents or machines, they harnessed the chemistry of ash, vinegar, herbs, and even urine. They bleached linens under the sun, preserved silks with perfumed sponges, and guarded their best garments like treasures. Every method spoke of necessity, of making do with what the world provided. And yet, through sheer persistence, they managed to achieve standards of cleanliness that defy the myths of a filthy, careless Middle Ages. Laundry also revealed the stark divides of class. Peasants bent over rivers, their hands raw from icy water, keeping a single shift clean enough for Sundays. Nobles entrusted entire staffs to handle their delicate silks, demanding perfection in fragrance and appearance. The act of washing became, in itself, a social mirror. To appear in clean garments was to show not only cleanliness but discipline, devotion, and, if one were rich, dominion over the labor of others. And yet, there were moments of common ground. Whether in a peasant village or a noble hall, linen undershirts and shifts were prized as the true foundation of cleanliness. Whether a poor woman scrubbing with ash or a noble laundress scenting garments with lavender, the goal was the same: to preserve dignity, to present oneself before community and God as ordered and respectable. In the rhythm of laundry, the shared humanity of medieval people is plain. The legacy of medieval laundry lingers even today. We still air out clothes in the sun, still use herbal sachets in storage, still prize the scent of lavender and rosemary. White linen remains a symbol of freshness, echoing its medieval role as a mark of purity. And though modern machines have lifted the back-breaking labor, the association between clean clothes and respectability endures. The phrase, "to come clean," still carries moral weight, reminding us of the link between fabric and virtue that was already well established in the Middle Ages. Perhaps most striking is how laundry illuminates the values of the time. It was not only about hygiene, it was about order, about fitting into one's place in society, about pleasing both neighbors and God. Clean clothes were a silent language, telling the world who you were and how you wished to be seen. To neglect laundry was to risk dishonor, to risk slipping out of the social fabric as surely as a thread pulls loose from cloth. So the next time we think of the Middle Ages as an age of mud and filth, we should remember the countless hands that scrubbed, wrung, bleached, and perfumed. The peasants who bent over rivers, the laundresses who labored in towns, the servants who handled silks with trembling care, all were guardians of a hidden art. Their work stitched together more than clothes. It stitched together the appearance and reputation of an entire society. Laundry in the Middle Ages was never trivial. It was the invisible scaffolding of daily life, upholding dignity, status, and identity. To clean a garment was to polish a life, to wash away not just dirt, but the dangers of shame and dishonor. And in that way, the story of medieval laundry is not about filth at all, but about humanity's eternal fight to be seen, respected, and remembered as clean.